When 72-year-old Beatrice was stripped of her ancestral home by her greedy brother, she was left with nothing but a worthless patch of dirt and a dried-up well. They laughed as they handed her the eviction notice, but they didn't know the old well was hiding a multi-million-dollar secret. The mahogany-paneled office of Thomas Beaufort, attorney at law, smelled of old paper and expensive cigars. A scent that had always made 72-year-old Beatrice Henderson feel mildly nauseous. Today, however, the nausea was fueled by a profound, suffocating grief. Her father, Josiah Henderson, had passed away just 3 weeks prior at the grand age of 96. Beatrice had spent the last 15 years of her life as his sole caretaker, watching the brilliant, formidable patriarch slowly fade into a shadow of his former self. Sitting across from Beatrice was her younger brother, Richard. At 65, Richard was the picture of corporate arrogance. Dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, he relentlessly checked his designer watch, audibly sighing as if the reading of their father's last will and testament was nothing more than a tedious interruption to his busy schedule as a Chicago real estate developer. Beside him sat his wife, Patricia, whose eyes darted around the lawyer's office, practically calculating the resale value of the antique furniture. "If we could get on with this, Thomas," Richard snapped, adjusting his silk tie. "I have a flight to catch at 4 Zau. The Hawthorne estate needs to be appraised by the end of the week, and I'd like to have the paperwork finalized." Beatrice flinched. The Hawthorne estate. It was a sprawling 60-acre property in the heart of Virginia's horse country. It boasted an 18-room colonial mansion, manicured rose gardens that Beatrice had tended with her own arthritic hands, and centuries of family history. For a decade and a half, while Richard was off building his empire and sending nothing more than a generic holiday card once a year, Beatrice had bathed their father, managed his medications, and kept the grand estate from crumbling into disrepair. Thomas Beaufort cleared his throat, adjusting his spectacles. "Very well, I will skip the standard legalese and proceed to the division of assets, as stipulated by Josiah Henderson's final revision of his will, dated just 6 months ago." Beatrice leaned forward, clutching her worn leather handbag. She expected to be granted the house she had bled for, or at the very least a trust that would allow her to live out her twilight years in peace. "To my son, Richard Henderson," Thomas read, his voice devoid of emotion. "I leave the entirety of the Hawthorne Manor, including the main residence, the surrounding 58 acres of pasture, the antique collections within the home, and all liquid assets held in the primary family trust." The words hit Beatrice like a physical blow. The breath vanished from her lungs. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. "Wait," Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. "Thomas, there must be a mistake. Daddy promised me. He told me I would always have a home at Hawthorne. He knew I gave up my teaching pension to care for him." Richard offered a tight, patronizing smile. "Dad was losing his mind, Bea. You know that. He needed someone with the financial acumen to manage the estate's future. It's an $8 million property. You can barely balance a checkbook." "I ran that house for 15 years, Beatrice fired back, a rare spark of anger igniting in her chest. "I changed his bedpans while you were vacationing in Monaco, Richard, and you were provided free room and board for your services," Patricia chimed in coldly. "It was a fair trade." Thomas Beaufort held up a hand. "Please, there is one final provision. To my daughter, Beatrice Henderson, I leave Tract 7. Richard frowned. "Tract 7? What the hell is Tract 7? "It is the 2-acre parcel of land situated at the extreme northern boundary of the property line," Thomas explained, sliding a plat map across the heavy oak desk. "It encompasses the old groundskeeper's shack and the collapsed stone well. It was legally subdivided from the main estate decades ago." Beatrice stared blindly at the map. She knew the area well. It was a barren, rocky patch of dirt completely obscured by overgrown briars and dying oak trees. The shack had no running water, a leaking roof, and hadn't been lived in since the 1970s. At the center of the plot sat the old founder's well, a massive stone structure that had famously run dry during the Great Drought of 1932. It was a local eyesore, filled with decades of debris. "That's it?" Beatrice asked, a tear finally escaping and tracing the wrinkles of her cheek. "A patch of rocks and a dry well? Why would he do this to me?" "The will is legally binding, Beatrice." Thomas said softly, offering a look of genuine pity that only made her feel more pathetic. Josiah was sound of mind when he signed it in my presence. Richard let out a sharp, cruel bark of laughter. Well, Dad always did have a twisted sense of humor. Listen, B, I'm not a monster. I'll give you 30 days to pack up your things from the main house. I'll even offer to buy Tract 7 off you for, say, $5,000. Save you the property taxes. You can take the money and check yourself into a nice little assisted living facility in town. Beatrice looked at her brother, seeing the utter lack of humanity in his eyes. She thought of her father. She thought of the countless nights she had sat by his bed, holding his fragile hand as his mind wandered through the fog of dementia. During his final days, Josiah had become obsessed with the northern boundary. "Water is temporary, Bee," he had mumbled, gripping her wrist with surprising strength. "But what rests at the bottom outlasts the drought. Don't let them take the stones." At the time she assumed it was the rambling of a dying brain, but now, looking at the smug faces of her brother and sister-in-law, a stubborn, burning resolve began to build in her chest. She had been stripped of her wealth, her home, and her dignity, but she would not let them take her pride. "Keep your $5,000, Richard," Beatrice said, her voice dropping to a steely whisper as she stood up, her arthritic knees popping in the quiet room. "I am keeping my land." "Suit yourself," Richard sneered. "Enjoy your mud pit. Just be out of my house by the 1st of the month." The transition was a nightmare of physical and emotional endurance. At 72, packing up 40 years of memories into cardboard boxes was a monumental task. Richard had locked her out of the family's joint accounts, leaving Beatrice to survive on her meager social security checks. She hired a cheap local moving crew to transport her few personal belongings: some clothes, her favorite armchairs, a few boxes of books, and her father's old journals to the dilapidated shack on Tract 7. When she finally stood on the porch of her new home, the reality of her situation came crashing down. The groundskeeper's shack was barely larger than a single-car garage. The floorboards sagged dangerously. The windows were clouded with decades of grime, and the air inside smelled of rot and mouse droppings. Just 50 yards away, standing like a grim monument in the center of the overgrown weeds, was the old founder's well. It was nearly 10 ft across, constructed of heavy, moss-covered fieldstones that reached waist-high. A rotting wooden roof still partially covered it, threatening to collapse in the next heavy wind. For the first 2 weeks, Beatrice simply focused on surviving. She scrubbed the shack with bleach, patched the leaking roof with tarps, and set up a portable camping stove to cook her meals. She washed her face using bottled water she lugged from a nearby gas station. It was humiliating. Every evening she could see the lights blazing in the windows of Hawthorne Manor through the distant tree line. She could hear the faint sounds of construction vehicles. Richard had already hired contractors to rip out the historic gardens to put in a tennis court and a swimming pool. But as the days turned into weeks, Beatrice found herself repeatedly drawn to the old well. She spent hours sitting on the crumbling stone ledge staring down into the pitch-black abyss. According to local historical records, the well was over 60 ft deep, dug entirely by hand in the mid-1800s. Since it dried up in the 30s, it had been used as a makeshift dumping ground. Her father's dying words echoed in her mind relentlessly. "What rests at the bottom outlasts the drought." Josiah Henderson was many things. Strict, emotionally distant, demanding, but he was not a fool. He had been a meticulous planner. Why would he deliberately cut his devoted daughter out of the will, only to leave her a specific, useless 2-acre plot? Why insist on keeping this exact parcel of land separate from the main estate years before his death? Beatrice's curiosity finally overpowered her despair. She realized she couldn't investigate a 60F drop alone. Taking a portion of her remaining cash, she drove into town to the local hardware store and posted a flyer on the bulletin board. The next morning, a rusty pickup truck rattled onto her dirt driveway. Out stepped Liam Davis, a 26-year-old local contractor with a rugged build, a tool belt slung over his shoulder, and a reputation for taking on odd jobs. Liam had grown up in the area and knew the Henderson family drama. The whole town was gossiping about how the wealthy Richard Henderson had exiled his elderly sister to the dirt. "Morning, Miss Beatrice," Liam said politely, taking off his baseball cap. "Saw your flyer. You want to clear out the found as well?" "Ma'am, with all due respect, that thing is packed with a century of garbage. Rusted farm equipment, old timber, mud. It's a death trap." "I will pay you $25 an hour, Liam," Beatrice said firmly, leaning on her wooden walking cane. "I need to know exactly what is down there. We will rig a proper pulley system. I will buy the harnesses and the winches. I just need your youth and your strength." "Ow was key." Liam looked at the determined set of the elderly woman's jaw, then out at the grand mansion shining on the hill in the distance. He harbored no love for Richard Henderson, who had recently fired his uncle's landscaping crew without severance. "All right, Miss B," Liam agreed with a slow nod. "But we do it my way, safe and slow." Over the next 4 days, Track 7 became a miniature excavation site. Liam constructed a heavy-duty tripod over the stone mouth of the well, securing a motorized winch. Wearing a hard hat with a powerful headlamp and a thick canvas coverall, Liam was lowered into the damp, claustrophobic darkness. It was agonizing work. Bucket by bucket, Liam sent up the debris of the past. Rusted wagon wheels, broken glass, petrified and feet upon feet of hardened mud. Beatrice sat at the edge, sorting through the muck with gloved hands, hoping to find a clue. Her arthritis flared terribly, her hands cramping into painful claws, but she refused to stop. By the late afternoon of the 5th day, Liam was 50 FT down. The air down there was cold and stale. Beatrice was sitting near the winch controls when the walkie-talkie on the stone ledge crackled with static. "Miss B?" Liam's voice came through, sounding breathless and strangely tight. "I'm here, Liam. Are you all right? Do you need to come up?" she asked, panic spiking. If the stone walls collapsed, he would be buried alive. "No, ma'am, I hit bottom. At least I think I did. But it's not dirt." Beatrice leaned over the edge, shouting down into the echoing chamber. "What is it?" "It's metal, Miss B," his voice echoed up from the dark. "There's a false floor down here. It's covered in mud, but it's definitely a solid iron plate." And hold on. There was a tense silence, broken only by the sound of Liam furiously scraping metal against metal. Beatrice held her breath, the summer heat beating down on the back of her neck. "Miss B!" Liam yelled, entirely forgetting the radio. His voice boomed up the shaft, echoing off the wet stones. "There's a heavy iron pull ring. I'm hooking the winch cable to it now. You're going to want to stand back up there. Whatever this is, it's heavy as hell." Beatrice's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She engaged the motorized winch. The machinery groaned, the heavy steel cable pulling taut, vibrating with immense tension. The motor whined, struggling against the weight hidden in the earth. Clang! A massive, reverberating thud echoed from the bottom of the well, followed by the sound of rushing, stagnant air. "Pull me up!" Liam screamed over the radio, his voice cracking with a mixture of terror and absolute shock. "Pull me up right now, Beatrice!" Beatrice slammed her hand onto the emergency brake of the motorized winch, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. The grinding gears shrieked in protest, locking the heavy steel cable in place. She threw the engine into reverse, watching the spool rapidly unwind as she hauled Liam Davies up from the suffocating depths of the old founder's well. The heavy tripod groaned under the sudden, desperate strain. Moments later, Liam's helmet broke the surface. He scrambled over the moss-covered fieldstones, collapsing onto the overgrown grass of Tract 7. He ripped his hard hat off, gasping for the humid summer air, as if he had been drowning. His canvas coveralls were completely caked in foul-smelling, century-old mud, but it was the expression on his face that sent a profound chill down Beatrice's spine. He was entirely pale, his eyes wide, and fixed on the dark abyss he had just escaped. "Liam, what is it?" Beatrice demanded, her voice trembling as she leaned heavily on her wooden walking cane. "What happened down there? Are you injured?" Liam shook his head, coughing up dust and wiping the grime from his mouth with a shaking hand. He looked at the elderly woman, his chest heaving. "Miss B, it's not a well bottom." That iron plate, when the winch pulled it open, it didn't just uncover more dirt. It's a door, a heavy vault door on massive steel hinges. It opened up to a dry, reinforced subterranean chamber built straight into the bedrock. Beatrice stared at him, the humid Virginia breeze suddenly feeling freezing cold against her skin. A chamber? Under the water table? "It's sealed tight with marine-grade concrete," Liam explained, slowly sitting up and catching his breath. When the plate lifted, the air that came rushing out was completely dry. "There are wooden crates down there, Miss B. Dozens of them. They are stacked perfectly against the stone wall." I shined my headlamp inside, and he paused, swallowing hard. "I think you need to see this for yourself. But you can't go down there. The harness would break your back." "I am not going down there," Beatrice said with a newfound terrifying clarity. "You are going to rig a heavy cargo net to the winch, Liam. You are going to go back down, and you are going to bring up the smallest crate you can find. We need to know what my father was hiding." It took Liam 20 minutes to regain his nerve, but the promise of uncovering the Hawthorne estate's greatest mystery propelled him back into the harness. He descended slowly, the cargo net swinging beneath him. The wait felt like an eternity to Beatrice. She paced the perimeter of the well, her arthritic knees aching, her mind racing back to her father's final cryptic words. "What rests at the bottom outlasts the drought." Finally, the walkie-talkie crackled. "I've got one, Miss B. It's incredibly heavy. Bringing it up now." The winch strained violently as the cargo net emerged from the dark shaft. Inside sat a heavy, military-style, olive-drab steel lockbox, perfectly preserved away from the moisture of the earth. Liam unhooked the net and dragged the heavy box onto the porch of the dilapidated groundskeeper's shack. He retrieved a heavy iron crowbar from his truck. With a grunt of exertion, he wedged the crowbar under the latch and snapped the heavy padlock. Beatrice stepped forward, her breath catching in her throat. She slowly lifted the heavy steel lid. Inside, meticulously wrapped in oilcloth, were rows upon rows of solid gold bullion. The afternoon sun caught the dull, heavy yellow gleam, casting a golden reflection against the grime of the ruined shack. Each bar was stamped with the insignia of a prominent Swiss bank, marked as 1 kilo of 99.9% pure gold. There were at least 20 bars in this single box alone. "Dear God," Liam whispered, taking a stumbling step backward. "Miss B, do you have any idea how much this is worth?" "A kilo of gold is almost $80,000. There's over $1.5 million just in this one box." Beatrice could not speak. Her trembling hands reached past the heavy bullion to a thick, wax-sealed manila envelope resting perfectly on top of the bars. Written across the front in her father's elegant, sweeping handwriting was a single word: Beatrice. She broke the wax seal, pulling out a sheaf of thick parchment. "My dearest Beatrice," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means my ultimate gamble has paid off. It means you possess the tenacity, the curiosity, and the resilience to look past the surface of the insult I dealt you. It also means your brother, in his infinite arrogance, took the bait." Beatrice's eyes rapidly scanned the page, tears blurring her vision as the genius of Josiah Henderson's final masterstroke was laid bare. "Over the last decade, as my health failed, I watched Richard hover like a vulture waiting to inherit the Hawthorne empire. I knew his greed. I knew he would cast you aside the moment the dirt hit my coffin. But the Hawthorne estate is not what Richard thinks it is. I've spent the last 7 years quietly taking out massive high-interest commercial loans and reverse mortgages against the manor, the land, and the business holdings. Richard thinks he inherited an $8 million kingdom. In truth, he has inherited $11 million in toxic, unpayable debt. The creditors will be knocking on his door within the month." Beatrice let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The absolute cunning of it was staggering. Every penny I stripped from the estate, I converted into untraceable gold bullion and bearer bonds. There are 50 crates in this vault, Beatrice, totaling nearly $40 million in liquid, untaxed, unrecorded wealth. I built this vault during the estate renovations of the late 90s, preparing for this exact necessity. I left you Tract 7 because I knew Richard would deem it worthless and never challenge it in probate court. The land is yours, the well is yours, the gold is yours. Use it to live the life you sacrificed for me. Let Richard choke on his ambition. I love you, my devoted daughter. Forgive an old man for his theatricality." Beatrice lowered the letter. She looked out across the overgrown, thorny fields of Tract 7, then turned her gaze toward the distant hill where Hawthorne Manor sat, grand and completely doomed. The tears finally spilled over her wrinkled cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of profound, overwhelming vindication. "Liam," Beatrice said, her voice entirely transformed. The frail, defeated, elderly woman was gone. In her place stood the true heir of the formidable Josiah Henderson. "Pull my father's truck behind the shack. We are going to work through the night, and then we are going to make a phone call to a very specific private security firm in Richmond." 3 weeks later, the atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled office of Thomas Beaufort, attorney at law, was entirely different. The scent of old paper and expensive cigars was overwhelmed by the pungent stench of Richard Henderson's panic. Richard paced furiously across the antique Persian rug. His bespoke Italian suit wrinkled and stained with sweat. His wife, Patricia, sat in the corner, her face buried in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. "This is impossible!" Richard roared, slamming his fist onto his heavy oak desk. "You are telling me my father leveraged the entire estate? That he mortgaged the main house, the horse pastures, and the commercial properties? Why didn't you tell me this at the reading of the will?" "I am merely the executor of the public will, Richard," Thomas Beaufort said calmly, adjusting his spectacles. He maintained a distinctly neutral expression, though a hint of satisfaction danced behind his eyes. Josiah kept his financial maneuvers strictly private, utilizing offshore accountants to manage the debt. "The estate is completely underwater. The first of the balloon payments defaulted yesterday. The bank has already initiated foreclosure proceedings. Furthermore, because you signed the inheritance acceptance paperwork so hastily to begin your renovations, you assumed all associated liabilities. You are personally bankrupt, Richard." "He set me up!" Richard screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "That old bastard set me up. He gave me a poisoned pill and gave Beatrice weight. Where is Beatrice?" The heavy oak doors of the law office swung open. Beatrice Henderson walked into the room, and the sheer force of her presence silenced her brother instantly. She was no longer wearing the faded, moth-eaten cardigans of a tired caretaker. She wore a stunning, tailored, charcoal gray pantsuit adorned with a simple, breathtakingly expensive diamond brooch. Her white hair was immaculately styled. Standing slightly behind her, wearing a sharp new suit of his own, was Liam Davis, acting as her newly appointed estate manager and personal head of security. "Hello, Richard," Beatrice said smoothly, taking the leather armchair opposite Thomas Beaufort's desk. She crossed her legs with elegant composure. Richard stared at her, utterly bewildered by her transformation. "B, how are you dressed like that? You're supposed to be rotting in that shack." "The shack proved to be quite lucrative," Beatrice replied, offering a cold, terrifying smile that perfectly mirrored their late father's. "It turns out Daddy had a very extensive savings plan hidden at the bottom of the founder's well, a savings plan attached exclusively to the deed of Tract 7, legally entirely mine." Patricia gasped loudly, her tear-streaked face shooting up. "Gold? The rumors in town are true. You found gold?" $40 million worth, give or take the daily market fluctuation. "At," Beatrice stated casually, examining her perfectly manicured fingernails. "Fully secured, heavily guarded, and legally processed through my new wealth management firm in New York." Richard looked as if he had been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed silently, his corporate arrogance entirely shattered. He fell to his knees, crawling toward Beatrice's chair. "B, please. We are family. I'm going to lose everything. The bank is taking the manor. They are seizing my properties in Chicago. You have to help me." Dad wasn't in his right mind when he did this. Beatrice looked down at the brother who had discarded her like trash. She remembered the 15 years of isolation, the endless nights managing their father's agony while Richard drank champagne on yachts. She remembered the cruel laughter when he offered her $5,000 for her inheritance. Dad was in perfect command of his faculties. "Richard," Beatrice said, her voice sharp as crushed glass, "he knew exactly the kind of man you are. You wanted the Hawthorne estate so desperately, you didn't even bother to look beneath the surface." "Please," Patricia wailed from the corner. "Where are we supposed to live, Beatrice?" Beatrice stood up, smoothing the front of her jacket. She looked at her brother and sister-in-law with an expression of complete, icy indifference. "I have already spoken with the bank holding the Hawthorne debt," Beatrice announced, turning toward the door. "I purchased the estate back this morning for pennies on the dollar at the foreclosure auction. The deed is now entirely in my name. The house is mine. The gardens," Clear's throat, "are mine. The legacy is mine." She paused at the door, glancing over her shoulder at the ruined man kneeling on the carpet. "I am moving back into the master suite this afternoon," Beatrice said quietly. "You have exactly 1 hour to pack your things and get off my property, Richard. If you are still there when I arrive, Liam will have you arrested for trespassing." Beatrice walked out of the office, the heavy wooden doors clicking decisively shut behind her. She stepped out into the bright Virginia sunshine, inhaling the sweet, fragrant air of the impending summer. The drought was finally over, and a golden era had just begun. What an incredible twist of fate. Beatrice went from being exiled to a worthless patch of dirt to owning a $40 million empire, proving that karma never misses a deadline. Josiah's brilliant revenge completely destroyed Richard's greed, leaving the rightful heir with the ultimate victory. If you loved witnessing this story of ultimate family vindication and sweet justice, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more amazing tales.